Kindly start, ma'am.
Hello and welcome to this CEDA IIC webinar. It's the first event that is being jointly organized by the India International Center and the Center for Economic Data and Analysis at Ashoka University. CEDA was set up 1 year ago at Ashoka University. And in some sense, this is the first anniversary, the birthday event for CEDA. The purpose of setting up CEDA at Ashoka was to primarily demystify data. Because when people think about data, they think of complicated numbers. They think numbers are designed to fudge, to obfuscate reality. And people at the same time, while they have this fear or mistrust of data, at the same time, these days on our WhatsApp universities, we see all kinds of numbers being thrown around on issues which actually obfuscate the reality, oftentimes mislead us, what is known as fake news. So how do we separate fact from fiction? How do we separate fake from truth? And how do we make sensible use of correctly calculated data averages to understand our economy and society and to develop reasonable policy? And in order to aid all this, we set up CEDA at Ashoka University. And what CEDA primarily does is to do two things. One is to promote data narratives. So we write short pieces that help us make sense of one issue at a time. So these are not complicated, long PhD thesis type of articles. These are short articles, but they're written succinctly, and we make use of data in the public domain. At the same time, we have developed a data portal which has calculated aggregates from publicly available data sets such as the National Sample Survey, Employment Survey, the national censuses, the National Family and Health Survey. And what the CEDA data portal allows users to do is to make connections across variables, across time, across geographies, and even across data sets. So for example, if you wanted to look at the labor force participation rate from NSS, and you wanted to look at, let's say, women with anemia in NFHS, normally it would be very hard to make that connection for a similar year for the same geography. But the CEDA data portal can actually allow you to do that. So it's very user-friendly, it's interactive, and it's new. And we are still experimenting. So please do use it. And let us know if you want us to either include more data, or if you have any trouble accessing any of the data, please do get back to us. So that's about CEDA. But today I'm absolutely delighted to announce the panel for this evening. I believe that it's what in Bollywood be called a kind of a casting coup. I have absolute stalwarts in the domain of socio-economic data in India, 3 individuals who have done immense service to the data infrastructure in India. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome them today. And I'm just going to set the landscape a little bit about the kinds of questions that we can ask and discuss in today's session. And of course, these conversations are not going to end with today's session, but the idea is to set the ball rolling. So the first question, of course, is that national level socioeconomic data is becoming an increasingly a scarce commodity. So we have CMIE, which brings out every 4 months. We have periodic data coming out of CMIE. The National Sample Survey data has now resumed, the labor force data has now resumed after a gap, but the Consumption Expenditure Survey data is still not available with us. And there are many other surveys that NSS used to bring out periodically, and it had a routine that we would look forward to as researchers and as users of data. But somehow that routine, that timeliness has been broken, and we are always just waiting for the next NSS data set to be available, and we don't know whether that's going to happen or not. The third data set that we will be discussing today will be the India Human Development Survey data, which has changed the face of research about socioeconomic issues in India. They have some variables that are similar to NSS, but they have many more that allow us to make connections between sociological issues like networks and who you know, et cetera, along with economic realities. So it's just changed the landscape of papers that are coming out. The kind of research that's been made possible by IHD's data is unparalleled. So to discuss all these data sets today, I have, as I said, it's going to be an absolute masterclass. So I have with me today Dr. Sonalde Desai, one of the chief architects of the India Human Development Survey, who's a professor of NCAER, professor at NCAER in Delhi, with a joint appointment at the University of Maryland as professor of sociology. And I believe they've just gone into the field with the third round of the IHD's data set. So, welcome, Sonal, and absolutely delighted to have you as a part of this panel. Our second speaker is going to be Mr. P.C. Mohanan, who is now the chairman of the newly formed Statistical Commission of the state of Kerala, and was earlier the acting chairman of the National Statistical Commission, who was involved, integrally with NSS surveys. And our third speaker, last but not the least, is Mr. Mahesh Vyas, the managing director and CEO of the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, who are the data set that I just mentioned. So it's an absolutely stellar panel. I believe they've never been together on a panel before this. So, I'm delighted to be the CEDA is delighted to be the vehicle that made this possible. And, we look forward to an absolutely amazing discussion. Let me just, before I invite them to speak, let me just highlight a few questions, and, of course, the speakers will add their own. So one of the questions is both the India Human Development Survey and the CMI is what is called longitudinal data or panel data, which means the same individuals are interviewed over a period of time repeatedly. Now that presents its own unique set of challenges. What if you don't find the person that you interviewed earlier? What if the household is split? What if two households merged and created a new household, etc.? What does it do to estimates? What does it do to the weights that sampling weights, etc.? How comparable are estimates from one round of a panel survey with another? I know these are a little bit nerdy questions, maybe, but I'm assuming there'll be some nerds in the audience. In any case, the speakers are fabulous, and they'll be able to explain to us, those who don't really deal with this kind of data, of the special challenges that that this data set, these kinds of data poses. The other question that I'd like to highlight is several of us, including in CEDA, we are doing commentaries. We have been repeatedly highlighting the question of increasing unemployment, particularly youth unemployment. And every time a commentary from CEDA goes out, there is a huge pushback, because people say, how can people be unemployed? They must be rich enough that they don't need to work. So if they are showing up as out of the labor force, it means they don't need to work, right? But that doesn't square with the kind of distress that we see around us. So what does being unemployed, what does, people who show up as unemployed, what does it mean for livelihoods? India is not the first country that has shown high rates of unemployment. In South Africa, for example, unemployment became so high that labor force participation rate itself started to fall. People were not even registering themselves as unemployed. And so the same question get asked there. If people are not looking for jobs, it must mean they're happy. They have enough, to live by, right? And so it's always a puzzle about unemployment, about how do people just drop out of the labor force? What do they do? So I think that would be something, and that's of course linked to the women's labor force question. Again, yesterday the Pew report came out, and today there's a story which said women don't want to work, or their husbands don't want them to work. Now, some of us feel that might not be the correct representation of reality. So, that's the other question. And a final set of questions that I'll just pose, and then I'll leave the floor to the panelists, which is particularly Mr. Mohanan, which is that NSS, of the three surveys that are represented in today's panel, NSS is the oldest one. Now, it's absolutely a unique institution and the unique survey of its kind that's been running for so many decades. in a developing country that did not have the kind of infrastructure that is needed to run surveys of this kind. And so the service that is provided to India and to policy making has been absolutely exemplary. But now when you look at some of the categories in NSS, they appear dated, right? Because they were developed at a time when the Indian economy was structurally very different. Now they say that if you want to study change over time, don't change your questionnaire, right? And so we don't want to change our questionnaire. But at the same time, we do want to recognize that the Indian economy, the structure itself has changed. The economic structure has changed. New identities have got created. Earlier for gender, you could just give male and female, and that would be enough. Today, you can't do that, or you should not be doing that at least. So how do we change sufficiently to capture the changed reality, yet not change so fundamentally that it then, over time comparison becomes meaningless? So these are just some of the questions that came to my mind, and I'm sure that the panelists will, add a lot of richness. Before I go, I'm going to just make an announcement, which is please type your questions in the Q&A box as the speakers are speaking, and they will be read out and will be answered by the speakers after they have given their remarks. So I'm now going to call the speakers in sequence. We will have their presentations, and then we will come back to Q&A and to discussion. So the first speaker this evening is Professor Sonalde Desai. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashwini. Thank you for this wonderful introduction, wonderful welcome, and most importantly, opportunity to speak to Mr. Mohanan, Mahesh Vyas, and you all at the same time. Okay. It strikes me that when we talk about data, we often don't distinguish between the purpose for which the data are being collected. And particularly in a rapidly changing country like India, we deal with three very different demands from survey data. I'm only going to focus on survey data. I won't focus on other kinds of data. But even with survey data, we have three different types of demands. One is we want to be able to monitor what's happening in India on a variety of parameters and indicators over time. Okay, so we want to get point estimates of unemployment, employment, infant mortality, total fertility rate, and so on. And as far as possible, we would like to get them pretty rapidly so we can see the change. Okay. Second demand that we have is we want to be able to disaggregate the data by geographic locations, because there is such a big demand from the policymakers that give us district level data so we can use it in district level planning. So that's sort of a second demand. And the third demand is we actually want to understand causally what shapes the kind of behaviors that we see and the outcomes that we see, and also evaluate the impact of public policies. Now, the three are very different types of demands, and they push us in very different directions. So as an example, if you wanted to get good point estimates of at any given point in time, PLFS and NSS is a very nice strategy. Okay, basically they will try to get as many geographic locations as possible, because the idea is that things like income, economic status vary much more between clusters than within a cluster. So get as many clusters as possible, pick out 10 households from each cluster and use that to give you sort of good point estimates. Okay. In contrast, if we think in terms of surveys like National Family Health Survey, they are really designed to give us estimates at a district level, and then the geography is very important. So whereas the NSS has like 120,000 households in its sample, NFHS has like over 7 lakhs or over 700,000 households as a part of its sample. Okay. Mahesh will talk much more about CPHS, but one of the things about CPHS that I find interesting is that in order to give good estimates of some of the factors that are of interest, they oversample urban areas, they oversample more educated households. And that's the structure that they have. Now, the survey that I know best, India Human Development Survey, Our goal is in some sense to understand what's happening over time associated with processes of social change, impact of public policy, and so on. And the scale at which we try to look is not quarterly, it's not yearly, it's not even 5-yearly. Frankly, it ends up being at a decadal level of change, okay? Which is both its benefits and its challenges. Okay? You know, a lot of things that we want to look at don't change as rapidly as quarterly or yearly estimates. These are changes that take sort of place over a longer period in time. Like, take an example. Suppose we are interested in what happens to children who are falling behind in school. Okay, we have to look at the children who are falling behind in school at one point in time, and then we have to look at them in terms of what happens over 5 or 7 years later. And interestingly, what we have found is that when we look at kids who were 8 to 11 at one point in time, and they became 15 to 18 at next point in time, children who were falling behind from richer families managed to catch up. Those from the poorer families did not. Okay, so these are the kind of trends that we are interested in looking at. Something else that we have found with IHDS data is, if you look at households which were poor at one point in time, okay, a vast proportion of them come out of poverty about 7 or 8 years later. But interestingly, some households that were not poor become poor. Okay, and in countries which are sort of rapidly changing and rapidly growing, the idea that we can give a BPL card at the beginning of a decade and expect it to sort of provide us with identification of the poor households 7, 8, 9 years after that card is issued doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay. So these are the kinds of insights that we manage to get when we look at changes over a decade. And hopefully we will actually continue this work to look at changes across generations. So, how do we link parental experience to their children's experience? Or for that matter, how will we see the impact of National Food Security Act? Okay, in terms of changes in consumption of cereals for the same families before and after the implementation of National Food Security Act. Okay, so those are the advantages of the kind of longitudinal studies that I have been engaged in terms of looking at it over time. The problem is that it also has its own challenges and its own weaknesses, and it drives me crazy at times. Okay, so take an example. The household, the whole notion of what is a household changes over time, right? At some point in time, we had, your Prithviraj Kapoor and his 3 sons. And at some point, you're going to end up with those 3 sons who now have their own families, and then their children will have their own families. Okay. What do you call a household? How do you trace them? Do you continue to follow all the individuals who split out of these root households that we had? Or do we kind of try to focus on only the people we can reach? Okay. One of the biggest challenges I have had, Ashwini, is that what we have been trying to do is we have been trying to follow the households that split, but mainly the sons of the household. Okay. Because the daughters marry out and they become part of some other household. And our initial assumption was when the daughters marry out, we let them go, but then we have new incoming brides into these households, keeping sort of our female sample more or less representative. But it's also very interesting to see, if I'm going to look at what happened to a child in his teenage and its impact on what happened to them as adults, okay, losing these women is a serious challenge. So the next round, when we get around, we actually are going to try and see if we can interview some of these women from these households who have moved away. Now, anybody in this room who actually looks at the financing of some of these surveys will recognize that it is financially impossible to go interview one woman living in Chittor, okay, from the household that was originated in Alwar. So what we are going to try and do is do some telephone interviews. So I think what ends up happening is that we end up sort of innovating in ways that we didn't plan when we started out this survey. We discover over time that some major changes have occurred. The other thing that was very interesting for me to see between the two rounds of IHDS that we have completed and analyzed, which is 2004-05 and 2011-12, that the amount of household resources that were coming from migrant remittances increased sharply. Okay. Now, much of our research on migration really has been challenged by the fact that NSS, the way it calculates out migration, basically underestimates out migration that we saw when the COVID crisis struck, right? So if you really want to understand the process of migration, remittances, how it affects families, who migrates, who doesn't, what public policies could reduce the migration, okay, we are going to have to figure out how to follow these households along with the people who are migrating. Okay, again, that's something we are experimenting with. Okay, now one of the things I would like to submit, okay, is that by all, there is not a single person who collects data who should not be humble about the problems that their data faces. Okay, every design has its own challenges, every implementation has its own challenges, and for the life of me, I can tell you of all kinds of things that we have dealt with that have been problematic in the data we have collected. Okay, we actually will just, all you have to do is ask me where the problems are and I'll tell you where the problems are. Okay, what we have found, however, is that there is something that is very exciting about being able to innovate and think about what, how do we view the transformation of Indian society through the lens of these longitudinal studies? What are the transformations that we need to start thinking about and tracking that we didn't even think about in previous rounds? Okay, will we make mistakes? Yes, of course. Okay, there are plenty of mistakes we make. The good part of it is that we are all academics. The mistakes we make, we have very nice explanations for why we made that mistake. We find that people forgive us for it and they will take whatever is the good that comes out of the data sets that we are producing. Okay? But there are a few things that I sort of want to stress for any of us who are doing data collection. Okay? I think that the notion of data collection in research methodology needs a lot more indigenization than we have had. Okay, I think much of the earliest data collection strategies that we used come out of these wonderful innovations that National Sample Survey did. But National Sample Survey itself has stopped experimenting. It has stopped evaluating its own data. Data quality has over time become an issue that even the Secretary Moresby acknowledges. Okay, so there are challenges of data quality that we all face, but we would hope that national data that informs public policy would be of much better quality, and perhaps some more experimentation around that is needed. But I think the bigger problem is that increasingly a lot of our data are driven by notions and technologies that have emerged in developed world. As an example, in the US, you can use Facebook data to do analysis of attitudes around COVID. When we start using Facebook data in India, some of my colleagues are finding that these are totally non-representative samples. Okay. Similarly, all my methodologist colleagues in the US tell me that you should have a question that is properly worded and your interviewer should be using exactly that wording when the question is administered. Okay, we translate our survey in 12 languages, but 12 languages is just not going to do it. You could have a Khari Hindi, and then there is the Bhojpuri, and then there is Braj Bhasha. Okay, how do you deal with some of these linguistic changes, and how do you ask your questions in a way that you will get the underlying concepts without introducing measurement bias? Again, these are the kinds of things that, my colleagues at National Council of Applied Economic Research are trying to study, to work with and experiment with. We sort of feel like, okay, if we made a mistake, there is not a huge cost. Okay, just do it. Okay. If some question that you asked, which everybody else think is kind of idiotic, but we think makes sense, we just put it in. Okay. And turns out that some of them get used quite a bit. So for example, when we were doing our data collection and we needed to have caste categories, we decided that we were going to just add one more category to the standard data collection structure, where we can distinguish between Brahmins and forward castes. Okay, that actually paid off, and there have been some very interesting articles of research that have been done out of it. So I guess what I would submit is that I think longitudinal data is very useful. Experimentation around collection of data is useful. Humility is required because, frankly, there will be mistakes in everything we collect, and we just learn from our experiences and experiences of our users and what they tell us and what they write. And I guess the idea is to do the best we can to study a society which is changing so rapidly. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonal. Very fascinating. Of course, there were lots of other questions, which I'll come back to. One of the ones that I would like you to talk about later is this innovation that you've done in measurement of women's work, not through the IHDS, but through your Delhi metropolitan area survey, how just a simple way of, if you change the way in which you ask the question, how the measurements change. And, maybe we'll come back to that later. So with this, I will move to Mr. Mohanan. Well, Mr. Mohanan, in addition to the questions I posed in the earlier, I guess one question which is common for all three of you is, all household surveys everywhere in the world are never able to capture the top end of the income distribution because the rich people don't answer household surveys. But we do need, if you want to understand inequality or many other factors, we do need information about the rich. So what can be the best way moving forward, given the fact that we know that the very rich people are not going to answer household surveys? But anyway, these are just, speculative questions. But Mr. Mohanan, please, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Professor Ashwini. Let me start by admitting that, I'll be speaking only from my experience in the National Sample Survey for many years and my experience in the government for many years. And basically, I will restrict to whatever I discussed to the socio-economic data because government has a large number of administrative data. And nowadays, we find most of the news items come from these administrative data sources. But I will restrict myself to this socio-economic data, in particular about the survey data. Now, when the NSS started in the 1950s, it was exclusively meant for the government because it was the Planning Commission and the government departments who were looking for data on various aspects, and there were no data available. So NSS basically concentrated on the requirements of different ministries all through in the beginning, many decades. Even now, I think it does that, no more associated with NSS. So basically, the situation has changed from what it was and what it's now. Now we all accept that government has a responsibility to provide data, or data is a public good, just like they build a railway or highways. It is the job of the government to provide the data to the public. And the citizens, they have a right to know what is happening around them, what is happening about the governance, about the society and the outcomes of various programs. And of course, researchers are also an important consideration for collecting data. Basically, a lot of data are analyzed now more by the researchers, not by the agencies who collect the data. And they know sometimes more than the collectors. I know. So NSS, as rightly mentioned by Sonal and others, basically NSS went for what we call a schedule approach. The questionnaire approach was not the one which NSS followed because of the complexities, the different languages, the socioeconomic conditions. It was best thought that instead of giving a particular question to be asked in a particular way, it would be much useful if the investigators are thoroughly trained. They understand the concepts. They know what it means to be employed. So instead of asking, are you employed or something, the investigators are trained to ask certain status, what do you do, how do you do, and things like that. So that is why they went for the schedule approach rather than the questionnaire approach. Nowadays, of course, most of the surveys, especially if you use the digital technology for collecting data, or if you use over telephone, it's all everything is on a questionnaire. You know, the question is fixed. You ask the question in whatever way. But I still believe that schedule, if you have a trained set of investigators, a schedule kind of a situation change, it's very important. But the problem has come over the years in NSS. Unlike the earlier time, the investigators used to go and live in the villages for a few days, which is no more feasible now or not required because of the better transport and other things. So there used to be a lot of time to go around the village and study. And even in a schedule, you don't ask. There are several things you don't have to ask a question. You can rather observe around them and record it without even asking that, which is again not the required thing. But the issue is now with all this data collected, I must admit in the very beginning, we had the best sort of data collected in the 60s, 70s and 80s. And I would say up to beginning of 90s, we had the best kind of data. But unfortunately, none of these data are available for you to do any research because these were never preserved or kept properly. Now, what we have are the current data on which, of course, we can find out a lot of issues of problems around that. Coming to one question, which is which Ashwini raised now, which I think all the survey agencies face is now we don't miss any rich households. Basically, the survey design is like that: we canvass houses randomly, we pick up urban blocks or rural areas randomly. So statistically, you don't miss out any rich people. And I have personal experience of. One of the chief minister of Calcutta, the West Bengal at that time, his house was there in our survey once upon a time. I was in Calcutta at that time. And we did go and survey that household. So actually, technically, we are not missing any rich household. The problem is, how do you get data from people about the consumption? The consumption of a rich guy is totally different from the consumption of a poor guy. Now, what you the same survey instrument that you use for a casual worker household or a agricultural labor households, that obviously can't be capturing the kind of consumption that rich people do. This is the major issue. And in a national survey like NSS, there's a tendency to have a uniform questionnaire. I mean, you can have different questionnaires to different people. One ideal situation would be that. Basically, if I have 4 or 5 different kind of questionnaires, I decide which questionnaire I actually administer to you or to so and so. But that has not happened. We have the same instrument to be used for all of them. And then obviously there is no way to record, even if somebody says this consumption, how do you record this consumption? Or sometimes, most of the time, the investigator herself is not familiar with these consumption items. It has never occurred to them that these are the possible consumption. So there is obviously, nobody is left out in the surveys, but the important aspect of consumption perhaps is not captured. That is, I do not have a ready-made solution. We have been suggesting that we could have different kind of instruments for different kind of households. But that again means a lot of complication for processing and analyzing the data. But this could be one solution. Same thing happens to your establishment surveys where you try to do the earnings. Even in self-employed enterprises, we try to collect the earnings data. Now, different kind of enterprises have different kind of activities. So your questions should be focused on those activities to retrieve the information about those things. But that's again not possible. We have a standardized format. So many times this kind of rigidities in the survey practices are responsible for some of these complaints that we get about the data. And the most important thing is, most of us in the survey know this, are the respondents themselves having the data? I mean, this is an issue which is very important. If I ask a certain general questions about what do you do, what did you do yesterday, or did you watch a movie, or did you, all that is okay. But if I start asking about the consumption or expenditure or the income from different sources, it's not always the case that the respondent has all the answers ready-made with them. I mean, assuming that they have the time and the inclination to sit with you and all those things, even then it's simply not possible for them to maintain all the information. This is a big problem which most of the people face. And this problem is coming more and more often because the respondents, they do not have the time to sit with you and give you all the information. In olden days, I know our investigators could go into the state, the village, they have all the time to sit with them in the evening or talk to them. And I myself, about 30 years back, I remember going around villages. Time was not a criteria because we used to live somewhere nearby town or somewhere and all that. But now that is indeed a criteria. And when I looked at the interview timings, I find that the time taken for interviews starting in the evening, they are substantially less than the time taken in the morning because the investigators do want to come back home after the last train leaves at 6 o'clock or 6:30, so he has to come back. So this is indeed data collection problems are now getting worse over the years. But the other side is that when you're doing a survey, there's a tendency to put as much information as possible. I know Sonal knows that. I think that your schedule and questionnaire keeps on increasing as the more consultants or the more people you consult, the larger would be your schedule and questionnaire. Because there's an economy, you think anyway you're doing a survey, why don't you ask this that way? Now, many of such data basically creates problem for the analyzer, and when you do research and all that, all the information are not necessarily applicable or captured in the same way. Now, for example, in the NSS employment survey, also we asked the consumption expenditure of the household. Basically, that is meant to rank the households into decile classes. It's a very rough way of asking what is your expenditure just by one or two questions. But I have seen researchers using this data just like the normal consumption expenditure data and estimate the poverty figures and come to conclusion that poverty has gone up or during the last year or 2 years. But obviously, I tell them this is not the right way of getting it. This can happen even in very well planned survey because the main objectives could be something. NFHS, I remember recently there was a controversy of the sex ratio coming out of the NFHS. Obviously, NFHS was not designed to estimate the sex ratio. But once you publish it, naturally, people will take out all these things. So there are a lot of issues like this in the data collection stage, but NSS still has a big role to play because one, it has the resources and the experience. I don't think many agencies have the resources to do a national scale survey, but they have been facing the problem that they have almost a sample size has been static over the years. I think the NSS sample size is lower than CMI sample size now. And with this limited sample size, there's a tendency to collect as much possible, and people do try to analyze it at state level when the sampling errors are very large. So this kind of a major issue is one of sample size in NSS. Then also they have a problem of depending on contract investigators, which was not the case earlier. Earlier, they used to have regular investigators who used to join and spend their entire lifetime, and they were really masters. They required very less training. But now when you have contract investigators, you need to train them every time. And that is also a big issue. And some of them, they may not be local people. The language, even in a state, within one state, you need, like Sonal mentioned very clearly, in UP, I know in Orissa or Bengal, very clearly, you need people who are familiar with the local language, who can actually ask these right questions or use the right word without bringing the respondent ill will and all that thing. So this is the economic, the complexities that we need to do it. But finally, before the question which Ashwini raised is the NSS not coming out with some of the reports. That is very unfortunate, I would say, because in sometime in 1999, 2000, we had a consumer expenditure survey, which ultimately was actually not accepted, but the reports were released. We had used a 7-day reference period and a 30-day reference period, and side by side we put it there. So naturally, if somebody asks what is the expenditure for 7 days and what is the expenditure for 30 days, there is a inbuilt mathematical relation between these two. That would be the way. But these reports were really released. But it's the same thing in the consumer expenditure survey which the government is now withheld. It would have been ideal if the reports are data are available, so that we could really investigate and find out what went wrong. Now, that would have been useful for all of us to really find out what went wrong. Was it a design problem or was it a problem of the data collection method, machinery or the people? So more transparency and more in-depth analysis of this NSS data are required now, especially if there are problems in the data. I remember when I was the acting chairman, we had this problem of using the list of companies received from the MCA, Corporate Affairs Ministry list we used as a list frame, and something like 50-60% of the units were simply not available. We could not locate them, probably from the address given to us. So the entire survey was not a successful one, but still we thought the report should be released and the problem should be brought to the notice of the people, so that next time this could be a lesson for improving the methodology. Unfortunately, that kind of a thing did not happen in the recent past. Yeah, the problems are not really brought out and the issues are not highlighted. And the last point I want to say is, of course, about the complexities in the measuring process. I mean, like employment, we all expect a unidimensional figure of employment. What is the number of unemployed? What is the number of employed? Now, given the situation in India, all of us know that a single unidimensional number has no meaning. And it's not a new thing. Right from 1969, when the new framework, the Andwala committee, which gave us the framework for employment measurement, they simply said in India, giving a one-dimensional figure has no meaning. So they suggested a variety of measures. The problem with the variety of measures is that people don't understand. They will say, "What are you doing? You have a daily status, your usual status. Give me one number." Especially the policymakers, they would like to have one number. So that is always an issue when you have a single number to describe a situation that is very, very complex. But it is required, I know. So there are issues in all these concepts and definition also. It's not just that the methodological issues. Applying some of these, as rightly mentioned by Sonal, applying some of the Western countries' notions on our soil has a lot of problems. At the same time, we also need numbers that we can discuss and that we can debate, and bringing out a complex series of numbers which are not amenable for general discussion is also its problem. So let me stop now. I'll wait for other issues to come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mohanan. This was really superb, and a lot of the history about the NSS that many of our listeners might not have even known. And of course, you pointed us to this, what is called the non-sampling errors in the process of data collection, something that we teach our students, but I don't think it's internalized as, and you brought it out very, very beautifully. I do have questions for you, but maybe I'll pass the mic over to Mahesh Vyas, and then we'll come back and there are already interesting questions coming up from the audience. So we'll take those as well. But Mahesh, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ashwini Deshpande, for organizing this wonderful session. So we have with us Mr. P.C. Mohanan, who is the sheet anchor. He represents the rock-solid system of India, the great national statistical system. And we all, kind of salute to that system really in great respect. And then we have the newcomers, Sonalde's system at one end doing this decadal survey, very ambitious long-term plan. And you have at the other end this upstart CMI doing fast frequency every weekly surveys. So this is quite some expanse from the sheet anchor in NSSO. And then you have a fantastic academic work in Sonalde's work. And this weekly kind of estimate pulsating and causing all kinds of noise in the media, required or not required. So one of the questions you had posted to me, Ashwini, was, why did you do this? Why did you start CPHS? Wasn't the world of academics busy enough for you to bring in more spin balls, more curve balls into the play? And honestly, I apologize for that. but it's a way in which we have been looking at data, and I can be blamed for that. So I'll tell you a little short story on why CPHS happened. Is the way we look at data. So CMI is not full of academics at all. We monitor the economy as a company to try to understand the economy, because through our understanding of the economy, we try to tell people in industry what is going on. So we don't publish academic papers like most of you do, but we try to tell a narrative, a story to people in industry, people in other places, in the financial markets as well, as to what's going on in the Indian economy. Now, when we do that, we found in the 1990s, really old times, that we weren't very happy with a concept called gross capital formation or gross fixed capital formation. Nice concept. We read up Richard Stone, we read up SNA, we understood all that. We're in great awe of our understanding that we have understood something complex now. So we can talk the jargon, so to say. But tell an industrialist what this gross fixed capital formation is, and the story just falls. So we came up with a solution to say it's not important to calculate only, not important only to calculate gross fixed capital formation the way the NAS does it, but be something more real. So what the NAS will do is it will say how much steel, how much cement, how much wood, how much so on and so forth has gone in, not consumed, not in stock. That's capital formation. Sorry for simplifying, Mohanan sir, but roughly this is what capital formation is. But that doesn't make sense because that is input which we did not consume, but did we get any capital formation from it? And the answer to that we gave is CapEx, an alternate way of looking at capital formation. And that is, who's setting up a steel plant? Somebody said, the Birlas said they're setting up a steel plant in Raigad. Wow, that's capital formation going to happen, maybe many years down the line. And then a steel mill came up. Now that's real thing happening. We know now all the bricks and the mortar and everything else that went in, a steel mill got created. So we now have a flow from observations, an entirely parallel flow of capital formation. Somebody said that he is going to set up a steel mill or a cement plant or a textile plant or an IT park. And we see it through its implementation till its commissioning. We see the action of capital formation to give an answer beyond academics to say, what is real capital formation happening in the country? It's a smaller number, but a more real number. So this is an example of innovation in measurement, in data. Then came a question that, this was internal. You have the Bombay Stock Exchange Index, the BSE Sensex Index on 30 companies. You have the Nifty 50, you have the BSE 500, and so on and so forth. Why are you picking on just some stocks? Why not take all of them? To understand not where do you invest, but what's happening to the equity markets in a more holistic manner. And that's what led to the creation of COSPI, CMI's overall share price index. Just move away from what is being done regularly to understand in a more objective way what's happening to the Indian economy. And in the same process came a disbelief on what the NAS is saying regarding the demand side. Because when we see how do they come to the conclusions on what is happening on the demand side of the GDP, it did not seem to be as realistic because we did not do a consumption survey regularly. So we were only deriving these PFCE numbers, we were deriving the GFCF numbers essentially from the supply side indicators. So like the CapEx database addressed in a way the inadequacy of the GFCF, we said, let us do a household survey to see if we can fill in the gap to understand what's happening to consumption. The inadequacy was only part of the problem. The bigger problem was the insistence of NSSO to say we shall do a survey only in a normal year. Because that was your requirement. You wanted the survey to feed into your NAS. But we want to know the PFCE in the abnormal years. We want to know what happens when there's a calamity. How much does the PFCE fall? NAS would not give us an answer to that. And therefore came the desire to do a regular survey. So I actually began with a quarterly survey. And in 2014, I stopped the quarterly survey and started the survey, which is 4 months. And the entire design changed to say, I will do the survey comprehensively every 4 months, but still make a monthly time series. So that was innovation. And the desire to do fast frequency, still not do the survey every month, do it every 4 months, but still build the long time series. So we innovated to get an understanding of what is happening to the Indian economy on the consumption side and tell our people who subscribe to our services to say, hey, look, this is what is happening to income, what is happening to consumption, and so on and so forth. So it came from a desire to understand the economy beyond what is offered by the official statistics, to whom I will say again, we salute, because they teach us, they tell us what is available to begin with. We can only innovate after they have done their work. So we can't function without them. So that is how CPHS came up. It came up to say that we have to understand the demand side of the economy, to understand consumption, expenditure, to understand capital formation. We leave government consumption, expenditure, etc., to the public finance data, which was available in good measure earlier. Nowadays, it's a little more complex, and trade data we take as given. So that's how this CPHS came. It was capital formation first, and then came consumption, expenditure, to understand the demand side of the Indian economy. That's how it came. And it also came through our experience in trying to explain to people in industry what is happening to the Indian economy. They were interested, genuinely interested in knowing what is happening. They wanted to read, they read the NAS data, but they can't make sense. They can't make business sense of it. Now, I don't think it's fair to say that you should only be an academic to understand national account statistics. I mean, there is application beyond the academia as well. And I always complain with the official and the government system to say, we are always softer to the academics. Oh, CMI is a private commercial organization. It's almost like, an outcast. But, I fight to find my place in this domain. So that's how CPHS came about. Now, we never thought that we are going to be the only game in town. It's the others who gave up. I thought I will have the good company of NSSO parallelly working and doing things differently. So I quite appreciate, we are doing something, we are innovating in a different way. And there is a desire that others are also there in this. So you see this multi-dimensional way of looking at the economy. One way in which, say, for example, employment. We ask the question on employment differently compared to what the UN statistics system will tell us, what the PLFS does, what the NSSO has done, what everybody else is doing. We are saying we don't give preference to employment status over unemployment status. That's what everybody else does. They say, if you are employed even for a short duration, doesn't matter if you're unemployed for the rest and you're desperately looking for a job, preference given to employment, we reject that. Now, is that right, wrong? Is not the question. The question is, you get a multidimensional view. If you see it one way, you get one estimate. If you see it another way, you get another estimate. It's not wrong, it's different. And that's a contribution we make. Exactly the capital formation numbers we give is not wrong. It is different. It gives a different dimension. So I think through our innovation, through saying that we are not looking at normal years, we are looking at every day is important. If I can give you a capital formation number for every day, I would like to give it. So this is private sector innovating and giving out data, making it available to as many people as possible. Interestingly, although we started doing this for the industry clients of ours, CPHS today is essentially used in academia, almost entirely used in academia. And we are amazed with the way in which it is getting lapped up, the way it is getting used, and so on and so forth. So that's a good thing to have happen. Now, we also, by the way, had expected that the NCAER survey called the MISH earlier, which used to get done, Rakesh Mohan used to run it, and before that there were SL Rao used to run it, etc. They had a nice consumption survey earlier. Now I think it's called ICE 360 or something, which is done by some people. So I expect more company in the household survey business. I will not be a monopoly, and there is no need, and there should not be a case of me being a monopoly. One question that has been raised in the media a lot, and Ashwini, you have also asked me to touch upon this a little bit, I'll be happy to do that, is that there have been allegations that we do not capture the poor adequately. I call it an allegation. And fair enough, I'm very happy that the question was raised in the media. I have answered that, and I will continue to work on that to answer that adequately and give a thorough answer. But let me tell you what the situation is. The first thing is that what is the problem? Is the problem with the outcomes, with what the survey is telling us? Like, you are not happy with literacy rate the way it is, or you're not happy with poverty the way it is. Yesterday, there was a webinar organized by us. Professor Anup Malani from University of Chicago made a presentation to say that income inequality declined during COVID times. Very counterintuitive. But he made the paper, he gave a 1-hour presentation making his case, and took tremendous amounts of trouble to address the questions of Jadrej and Somanchi. To say, if they're saying that the CPHS is not representative of the poor, I'm actually addressing those questions, testing the household survey and the sample for robustness against such a claim. And you can go into the YouTube video to what he concludes. I will not say anything about it, but I do come out fairly good in that. So, so there's a robust check by a completely outside entity, a researcher trying to address the question. Now, if it is outcomes, I can't complain. I can't do anything. The outcomes come the way it is. You can then even complain that the unemployment rate given by CMI is not okay. But if you think that the processes are a problem, I can address it. That is entirely my responsibility, and I take full responsibility for it. So if the claim is, like I've stated, that we start from the center of the village and then go to the outskirts, and this implies that you are therefore giving higher weightage to the main street, to the inner part of the village compared to the outer part, and it's not random enough over there. We have said that it is not possible that we do not go to the outskirts. Just simple arithmetics of the size of a village, but we are still compiling data now on trying to find out which of the households are in the center of the village or on the main street and which are the ones on the outskirts. So we're actually drawing up that and collecting that data. It's taking more time than I had anticipated, but I can assure you, and I can assure all the people on this platform, and it's public, that when I collect this data, I will make it public. So go check it for yourself. How much is the sample, or how much has the sample been correct, or how much has the sample not been represented? I will make it public so that you can make your corrections if you would like to. But if I find something to be wrong, and if any one of you find anything to be wrong, from that finding, I promise to make corrections to the sample as well. So it's not just about saying that I'm right or I'm not wrong enough. It's about admitting the problem if you find it and going ahead and making the correction as well. So that's my stance on this criticism regarding this not being a sample which is representative of the poor or not. I think in many, many ways, it is very, very representative of the poor people of India. We have got no bias against the poor. In fact, it is much easier to get responses from the poor compared to getting responses from the rich. I require to send people of greater skills to those gated societies, make calls to the president of the society, make calls to the secretary of the society, request them to please allow us to come in sometime, take passes, make phone calls, and then go into the interviews over there. And even after this, they may say they shut the door on us. Saab ghar pe nahi hai. So We deal with all of that. It's far more difficult. So if somebody told us, so when I told this to my colleagues about this criticism, they laughed. They said they should have said that we are not capturing the rich enough, because that's where the struggle is. And that's where the non-response can be high. Mind you, people from the industry did say that your attrition in the rich households is higher. And we corrected that. We did find that in Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, and one more state, and we did correct that. So if there is a problem, we will fix it, but it is unlikely that we are not touching the poor. Our colleagues are so happy to go to the poor because they go into the deep interiors. They make a little more money when they go into the deep interiors. So they get a little higher pay when they go there. Cities, you're in the city, you don't get that TADA kind of addition when you go into the interiors. A. B, those households are very happy to give you responses. So our likelihood of missing the poor is very low. So anyway, that's a little segue into that part. One question that you have had, and I think others have had as well, is your data is too expensive. Or I don't think it's expensive at all. Not at all. So if you compare it to NSSO, yes, we could be very expensive. But if you take all the rounds of NSSO and pay for each of them, you will add up to the same amount that you pay for the CPHS data. I did the calculation, so don't bother. So, but that's not fair again. What is important is that I think you should look at the cost of this data as equal to what we pay to one person from your institute. The annual salary demanded by one postgraduate from your institute or a PhD student from your institute is what you pay for all the data we have collected since 2014. So this is not expensive by any yardstick you use. But still there's a case that, can you make this data public? Can you make it easier? I think, if I may, Professor Ashwini spent 2 minutes on the economics of this, and I think it's really, really valuable. So no data is free, of course. The data collected by NSSO is tax paid. So we are all paying for it. And we are all paying regularly for it. And we are saying, we are paying the data, sir, but you're not giving us the data back. All taxes are paid, but we are not getting the data back. In CMI's case, or in private enterprises case, we are not even like Sonalde's position, I assume, where you take a funding upfront to conduct the survey. We take huge risks because we put equity funding, our own money, into do the largest survey, the fastest survey, the costliest survey. And then come with our hat to you to say, now, do you find it good enough to buy it? And you still say, oh no, there are no poor people in this, I'm not buying it. So we face the risk and we don't still charge you extraordinary amounts of money. So I think this is fair. Now, the larger the number of subscribers to this, the lower the probability the price will rise. And we can invest more into getting the survey to be better, larger, so on and so forth. But we have another model, that the corpus of a financing place, let us say, maybe it is some benefactory, like let us say Azim Premji Foundation, is funding an institute to buy CPHS for their work. I think that is fair. Instead of taxpayer paying it, it's best that some foundation pays Ashoka University so that Ashwini's team can buy it. I think that's a good way of doing it. If all taxpayers don't have to pay for it. Now, we also say that we have a more expensive model. If you want to add some questions to our survey, then we charge a much larger sum, and that's what breaks even the survey. Your subscriptions don't. The 10 lakh rupees per annum don't break even. We take those larger projects which cost a much higher sum to actually break even. So there's a little subsidization over here as well. So that's my little point on the business model. I think that's all that I was going to speak. I've touched upon points which are more in the realm of fast frequency, no normal year, what we fought against to say, let's do it differently. That's it, differently and relevant. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Mahesh. That was quite amazing, actually. And we learned a lot. I think this is a debate for another time about, data collection, public, private, availability, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I think it's an important conversation to be had. And thank you for putting these issues in a candid manner on the table. So what I find amazing about the current state of data availability in India is, on the one hand, while official data is sort of drying up, at the same time, we are able to have these conversations. And in fact, on CPHS data itself, there have now been papers written comparing CPHS with NSS, et cetera, et cetera. And I think those are all very welcome developments. The fact that we can debate, we can discuss, we might not agree on every point, but the fact that we can debate and discuss, I think it's a very welcome development. And I think going forward, we should definitely continue this conversation and this dialogue. And you're right, Mahesh, in the sense that somebody or the other always pays for the data, whether it's a taxpayer or a private foundation or a university gives a grant, etc. The question is, what is the model that will work from the point of view of, say, students and researchers in India? And it's a fair enough point that I think it's open to discussion. But thank you first of all for this high frequency data did help us to look at changes in real time. And, at a time when NSS and official data have really dried up, CMI is one that all of us have been using. And you're right in saying that even though it was not designed for the research community, in the end, the research community has actually ended up using it quite a bit in the last 2 years, as you know. So, one can't complain too much. And although it's not, every university in India probably is not going to be able to pay the 10 lakhs, because budgets, etc., public university funding is of a different kind. We should be grateful that at least some data is available. But I think that the point to take away from Mahesh's intervention, and especially contrasted to Mr. Mohan, is to pay very close attention to how a variable is measured and what it is measuring. I think that's the lesson that all of us, whether we are journalists or we are academics or students, that's what we have to understand. I think, on some level, CEDA that's what we are trying to promote, which is understand what you're talking about, and it's not that hard actually. So unemployment is a concept, and it's just a question of how you measure it. But once you're clear about how you're measuring it, then you know what you're discussing. So let me actually, now there are lots of interesting questions that have, oh, there they are. Okay, I thought I'd lost them. So I am going to read out the question. Most of them are not directed towards anyone, so feel free, all three of you to answer. So the first one, how important is the role of attitude towards women's work in explaining low female labor force participation rate? How the data sets under discussion attempt to measure/quantify it? This is Neha Verma. Sonal, you want to go first on this?
Yes, sorry, unmuting myself.
Could we have a gallery view, sir? Mr. Biswas? Could we have a gallery view for the audience? Oh, go ahead, Sonal.
Okay. Let me actually start with the question you had asked before, and Aruna Bagchi had mentioned, and then let's turn to Neha's point. Okay.
Okay.
Aruna Bagchi had a question saying that how do you deal with measurement error? Okay. How do you know there is measurement error? How do you deal with it? And when we think about women's work, that's where it really kicks in. So I don't want to answer Neha's question until I kind of respond to that question.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So what happened was, for us, for me, I have tremendous respect for NSS, and NSS was always the gold standard for anything I do. Okay. We went out and did India Human Development Survey round 1, and we ended up with a higher female labor force participation than NSS. Okay. And I was very apologetic. Okay, I'm apologetic in print on that one, saying that, well, we must have been picking up something that wasn't exactly meant by NSS to be picked up, etc. Then we went out and did the second round of it, and this is when NSS, so ours were 4-5, in 11-12, when NSS was also 4-5 in 11-12. NSS shows this great decline in female labor force participation, and the IHDS did not. Okay. And then I sort of started wondering as to what was happening and why this might be happening. Okay. I was still sort of convinced that, oh yeah, NSS must be correct. Okay. And then of course, studies like CMI come out, which have 9% female labor force participation rate, and we are showing like, over 40%, right? So what on earth is going on and how we might be measuring something incorrectly? So we decided what we'll do is we'll set up an experiment. Okay, we had an experiment in which we interviewed the same people in a relatively small sample in Delhi NCR region, urban and rural. We first asked them, what is your employment status? And then we go into more detailed questions, asking them, does your household have any farm? Okay, did you work on that farm? Does your household have any animals? Did you take care of that animal? And so on and so forth. So the kind of trying to figure out these questions in slightly different ways. And lo and behold, what we find is that there is an enormous difference in labor force participation rate that we are picking up for the same people, depending upon the way we worded this question. And that was particularly true for the rural women, because the rural women did not see themselves as working. They saw themselves as, we are raising children and we're raising chicken and we are doing this and that and so on. I remember at one point in time in a village doing interviews, and we would pass this shop and there was a woman selling, basic kirana shop, little things over there. And by chance that became a household which we were interviewing. When I went to interview her, she says that, well, I don't work really. And I said, but I have seen you every day sitting here in the shop. How come you don't work? Okay. She says, no, but my husband owns a shop. He basically runs it. Okay. And so I said, okay, but where is your husband now? Oh, he's a teacher in the nearby town. So in fact, he has a full-time job. He's the shop owner, but she's running it. And she doesn't call herself as being unemployed. Okay. So I think that finding, and since then, by the way, I have stopped being apologetic about our employment statistics. I'm convinced that perhaps we may be on a better track than the regular decline that both NSS and PLFS are recording. But in any case, if that is the case, right, we are not picking up women's work because there is this whole issue of attitude and norms where women don't see themselves as working. Okay. So I think to respond to Neha, okay, Neha, there is the issue of norms, but the norms applies to two things, okay? It applies to whether women see themselves as working and they report themselves as working, okay? And particularly when your NSS interviewers are not nearly as well trained in probing and finding it out, okay? And then whether norms applies to whether they actually work, okay? And here I would actually like to refer to some of the work Ashwini and Naila Kabir have done, okay, where they basically found that women, there were a large number of women who were willing to work as long as work was available, okay. Similarly, there have been experiments that are done by Rohini Pandey and Charity Moore. Again, when they actually made work available, people were willing to work. So I think this is going to be a continual debate in our society, whether the problem is female labor supply is low because women don't want to work, or female labor supply is low because they can't really find the work they want to do. Now, one thing we have found is that unemployed women work and college graduates work. It's the women with the middle level of education who are not working. And part of it is because if you're a 10th class graduate and a man, you can be a postal carrier, you can be a truck driver, you can be a mobile repairer. But same options are not always available for women with that level of education. Hence, uneducated and low educated women work because their households have land and animals in which whom they can care for. Highly educated women work because they can find office jobs. It's the middle group, okay, that's not working. And if that is the case, then perhaps it's not norms as much as the availability of jobs. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonal. No, this was very, very beautifully explained. This whole norms debate is just raging particularly in the academic sphere. Everything is norms now. By the way, so Aruna Bakchi has a comment for all three of you. I find this discussion by experienced survey analysts very interesting and applaud them for their frankness and humility. So, congratulations all of you for your frankness. But her question is, how do you discern bias in the survey instrument itself? Or how does the profession deal with this problem? So Sonal answered that in the context of women's labor force participation. And if you want to have something to add to that, you could. Otherwise, I'll move on to the next question. Mahesh, Mr. Mohanan?
Yeah, I would just say that, the decline in the women's participation that came up in the NSS, I do remember looking further down, further disaggregating. The decline at that time had happened in the unpaid family worker category. I mean, that was what was very clearly coming out, because women, we have those who are employed in the principal status and subsidiary status, and maximum decline happened in the unpaid family worker category. Either they stopped going out, reporting, or we do not know, but that was the category which went down further. And further, just to add that, if you look at the educated women's unemployment is highest, basically, especially in the rural areas, because it is these women who cannot really go out to towns and look for work. They are not among the migrants. Like, we have a huge amount of migrants for workforce, but they are not actually females. So women have certain other restrictions, even when they're educated, it's not easy for them to go around and even take up work in other places. These things are, and if you look down on the NSA data, further decompose it, you can get it. Then, of course, there are also the problem of the respondent, the respondents who answers the NSS questions, as far as I can say, that it is those who are available in the senior people in the households. Either it's 50% women and 50% men. And these are the people who are less likely to educate. The senior people in the rural areas, still you will find some of them can't really read and write. These are the key respondents for the NSS. I don't know about mice. So I think probably they also face the same thing. So the attitudes are different. I mean, even if you explain the whole thing, there's a lot of other things at play. And that is become very clear during the time use survey. If you look at the time use survey data and the women's participation, there is an issue there. And second issue is actually time use gives you the participation, but not the quantifying the time spent on that. Whereas NSS, we more look at the time spent on that. If the time, even if they are doing actually work activity, but if the time is comparatively less, then we give importance to the other activities. So all kinds of issues are involved in that. But I think it's important that we understand and try to discuss these reasons, and again, something will come out. Thanks.
Mahesh, yeah, you want to add? Yeah.
So I just want to add a little bit to the discussion, taking off from what Sonalde said, is that CMI says that the female labor force participation rate is 9% of the women are employed. And the PLFS could be saying it's around 20% or so. And more deeper surveys of the kind that Sonalde has done on an experiment basis say it's 40%. Roughly. I mean, I may be wrong by orders of some small magnitude, but still it is 10, 20, 40. So it doubles. I think the inference from here is that around 10% of the women are employed by their own belief of them being employed. And if you stretch the definition of their employment, like they're sitting in a shop till for the lunch break, for example, then they are employed, or they're milking the cow for a household that is also into some dairy business, then they are employed as well. So if you stretch the definition of employment, I'm deliberately using this term, then more women are employed. But that's not the case for men. So I think we should, instead of debating the issue of measurement, we need to shift the focus that all women require better quality employment compared to just focusing on stretching the definition of employment. The inference is 9% of the women do feel that they're employed. The remaining, we are stretching the definition to make them feel that they are employed. Sorry, I'm still being...
With apologies, Mahesh, yeah. This is a bit of a pejorative statement.
No, it's not pejorative.
It's a problem to face.
I'm not passing comments on people. I'm saying this is measurement.
No, but Mahesh, measurement is an issue with women's work in India. The thing is that, these household enterprises are the income earning enterprises for the household. And the men working on those enterprises are counted as workers because they have a say in, the earnings of that enterprise.
So it is not that in the CPHS, you will not find women working in agriculture in rural India. They are, and they are working in horticulture as well. So we are capturing that. It is just how much of the time do they put and what do they do in other times that makes the employment really very low down in the pecking order of employment and unemployment. So I think it's not pejorative. It is to say that there is data captured in 2-3 different ways is telling us 2-3 different stories. They're all telling us different stories, and that's what we need to address. The problem is giving better employment to women.
No, that goes without saying. Nobody is disputing that. But I think that the measurement issue is not to be dismissed. Certainly not. Anyway, we'll come back to that. This again is not a discussion that we can conclude today, but there is the issue. Before we, I'm mindful of the time. So there is a very interesting point by Naresh Saxena. I'm going to read it out. India's official statistical architecture at the central government level is considered quite impressive, pedigreed, and wide-ranging, but not at the state government level, where data is collected by the departments that are in charge of implementing programs, and hence there is conflict of interest. State governments do not discourage reporting of inflated figures from the districts, which renders monitoring ineffective. The practice of fudging data is so widespread in all the states, presumably with the connivance of senior officers, that the overall percentage of severely malnourished children in case of 0 to 3 years, according to data reaching GOI from the states, is only 2%, as against 9.4% reported by UNICEF in their survey. The field officials are thus able to escape from any sense of accountability for reducing malnutrition. Why are our academics not highlighting the difference between reported and survey data? So the question is, capabilities between, so I'll let Mr. Mohanan go first on this.
Yeah, since I'm currently actually looking at the state data, basically there is certain amount of truth in that. The state level data sets created either from even the state samples or from the state administrative procedures, these are not really critically examined or used by the researchers as far as I know. Most of you actually work with NSS or the CMI or that kind of large data sets. The actual data sets available at the states are not critically examined. So there are large number of deficiencies that will come up, and none of the state people have a policy of disseminating the data. So far, I have not seen any state actually coming out like the NSS. I wanted to correct Mahesh here. The NSS data are now free. I mean, they don't charge anything. Of course,
free. I also
the taxpayer component is always there. Nothing comes free. I agree, but you can download it anytime. But none of the states that I know actually make the data available for any research purpose, and there are not much research studies also. Because most of you concentrate on the national level data, which are easily available and accessible. So this is actually a fact. But when it comes to administrative data, I mean, there's a big issue. We need another day to discuss the whole thing. For example, now you have a national data portal for the unorganized workers, e-Shram portal. Something like 26 crore people have registered in that. And look at the occupation that is reported. In New Delhi, you find some 3 lakh people are registered for agriculture occupations. I mean, I don't know what agriculture they do in New Delhi. So, and then half of the adult population in the UP are registered under the portal. 8 crore people are registered under the portal. Now, these kind of administrative numbers are coming out from these portals have very little use for research purpose. I mean, you don't even know, there are black box. Some numbers come out, you don't know what was the definition, who does it. So the same thing happens to state level now. Large number of data are collected by state. Nobody knows how it is collected, who collects it, and even you don't know where to get it actually. So there is some truth in the criticism or in the question raised by.
Is there any other response? Sonal, do you want to come in, or shall I move to the next question? Next one. Okay. So Manoshi Das has a comment actually. She's an ADB social development specialist. I'm working in Bangladesh, and during COVID, we had an interesting experience conducting research on educational needs and livelihoods needs in Bangladesh. We also had to use mobile telephony to ask parents regarding educational problems faced by their children. But the issue was an upstream one, how to train investigators adequately, also with COVID restrictions. We were lucky to get highly educated young candidates, but we had to train them remotely through Zoom workshops. But they did a valuable job, and we've been able to develop a strong report and livelihood development plan for our project. Just sharing our experience. Thank you. Thank you, Manushi. I'll let actually Sonal respond, and then Mahesh.
Yeah. Manushi, we have done exactly the same thing, and it's very difficult. Okay, those were the times when we all knew that we needed data. We couldn't get any data. We all wanted to try and collect the data the best we can. So my colleagues at National Council of Applied Economic Research also undertook some telephone surveys, again training interviewers remotely. But I remember organizing a very interesting webinar on that topic, where actually there was a very interesting comments by Renana Javwala and then Pranab Sen, where they basically said, maybe there is something we have to learn out of what is going on right now and try to figure out hyper-local data collection strategy, okay? Because people who are very local actually understand, first they will be able to reach out people in different ways than we can, and maybe we'll get better quality data. And that comment has really stayed with me, and maybe something it's worth thinking about for all of us. Thank you.
Mahesh, I know you also had to move to phone survey initially, right? So perhaps you could also respond to this comment.
Yeah, thanks. So we had a challenge as soon as we found out that this pandemic is moving in a dangerous direction. We started preparing for an eventuality that we will have to shift to a telephonic survey. And by the time the pandemic, actually the lockdown came in, the problem was the lockdown. By the time the lockdown came in, we were prepared. So we did not lose a single day because of the lockdown. We have a machinery, unlike the case that Manoshi Das is talking about, where she had trained people remotely, etc. We have a trained workforce, interviewers all over the country already, about 350 of them. So 350 people are there in the team who are already trained. The problem is they couldn't move out. They had to switch to telephonic survey. But we had to do a lot of rejigging of our processes, our validation systems, and quickly also on redoing the sampling selection, so on and so forth. But I think we were quick to react and therefore did not lose a single day. But unlike Manoshi's case, we had a ready, trained team already in place.
Thanks, Mahesh. There are two questions specifically for CMIE, so I'm going to just read them together. One is Mrinalini Jha's question. Could you please throw some light on the strategy used by CPHS to include fresh households in lieu of those dropped? And speaking from the concern that if the drop in the household is not random, but inclusion of fresh households is, that may potentially change the sample characteristics. That's one. And the second is by Ravi Subramaniam, who asks, since CMIE conducts panel surveys, what is the risk of respondents tailoring data? Are there checks to prevent / reduce this?
Okay, so the first question is, we try our level best not to let a household get dropped. And why do I say that? Because the interviewers will tell us that we require to drop this household. They're not responding, or the household is not there, etc., etc. Actually, it could be a rich household, which is making it very difficult for the interviewer to get the data from them. So there is a bias that initially comes in by the interviewer saying, drop this household because they're not responding. So we make it very difficult for a household to be dropped. So any question of dropping of a household from the panel is escalated all the way to the top manager, and an intermediate person is sent to the ground to check the system before the household is dropped. So we first of all don't let households to be dropped. And remember one thing, we conduct the survey this time, there's no response. We go a second time, we go a third time. If we fail on third time, a person is sent to ensure that there's no dropping. So we took many years, I may say, before we checked whether the dropping of the households is random or not. Initially, we just said if a household is dropped, just replace it. So randomly pick a household in the same CB or the same village or the same kind, and you keep going. But later on, when one industry user said that he suspects that we are missing out rich households, we went on to see where the attrition is. And we did find some problems that the attritions were systematic in some places, and we had to make corrections. Since then, we have been very conscious. Every April, we have a check on the entire sample whether there was a systematic bias in the dropping and the new ones coming in. So we are conscious of this, but I must admit, we took time to realize this problem. We did not know it initially. So your question is bang on. We learned the hard way, but we did correct this, and it came from industry. The second question is CMI panel surveys. What is the risk of respondents tailoring data? I don't know how they can tailor data. The respondent may not be the same. Today, I come to the household and I see Mr. John. And when I come next time, it is his daughter, Miss Alicia John, and so on and so forth. So the people do change, and they don't have so much memory over a 4-month period to tailor the data. And what is their incentive to tailor the data? I don't quite appreciate. Maybe Ravi Subramanian can expand why does he say that, and then I can answer it. But I really don't see this to be a problem.
Okay, Manushi. Okay, so I'll take the last question by Sudha Rao, and then maybe we can conclude, which is there's an increasing reliance on administrative data, especially in terms of announcing policy outcomes. There's also big hype on the use of real-time big data. How does the panel view these two sources and their role? And admin data is actually, Mr. Mohanan also touched upon it. Today, if you look at the Swachh Bharat Mission data, now everything is 100%, so you really have no way of telling the actual, realities on the ground. Electrification also is suddenly now shot up to close to 100%. So, there is a question mark about some of the administrative data sets, but, there they are. And use of real-time big data. I don't know whether, Sudha, you mean data that's scraped off the internet in terms of Google mobility, etc. Is that what you mean? I don't know. But anyway, I'll let the panel respond to that. Mr. Mohanan, you want to start?
Yeah, I will just say that what the NSS or what most of the national surveys, what they give is something like a bird's eye view. And what you do, researchers do go study a particular place, a particular village, you get a worm's eye view kind of a thing. And now that we have a third view, which is the official view, which come from these administrative things. So there are 3 different views, and not all of them actually are on the same agreeing stage. Administrative data are excellent, but as your pointer gave us example, these need to be validated through surveys, independent surveys. Just as a Swachh Bharat, when the first time the NSS said that it's not 100%, it was very good, but it was not 100%. Then officials came up and saying that no, they were biased because they were expecting some benefits from the government, so they did not report it. Now the NFHS has reported exactly, I think in the SIDA, you're going to do that. Yes. The NFHS reported exactly what the NSS has reported. It's very good, but it's not 100%. So the administrative data needs to be validated through independent sample surveys. That is my only suggestion.
Sonal, you want to comment on this?
Yes, I have to say that, part of me just loves survey data because that's what I do, that's what I understand, where I can somehow have a sense of people rather than a sort of a big institutional structures. And yet I have begun to believe that we need to be open to a variety of data sources and sort of look at them in a more careful way to triangulate it. So for example, I thought some of the earlier data that I had used on Manrega was very good quality. Okay. So in some sense, all administrative data are not created equal. Some of them can be used in very interesting way. Also, some of the questions that we would like to answer are not very easily answerable through the kind of household surveys that we do. And that's where, again, where you need different sources of data. There are also these incredibly brilliant researchers who do some very interesting work, like, looking at things like railway trips to estimate when migration is taking place and what kind of migration and resources and destinations and so on. I do have some concern about selectivity in technology-based big data. I have to say I still love them, but I worry about it, because I feel that in some sense, the access to some of these technological means selects people from upper socio-economic groups. And so, for example, Facebook data that's collected in India on this Facebook COVID survey, they are mostly reported by men rather than women. Okay. So educated rather than less educated. So there are all kinds of selectivity involved in it. Again, we can figure out some way of sort of accounting for it, dealing with the biases and so on in some statistical or sensible fashion. But I think we need to take all data we can get, use them selectively, and triangulate them as best as we can.
Mahesh, do you have any response?
I think we should distinguish between administrative data and institutional data. Institutional data is more broad. So if you bring in Facebook and Google, etc., then that's institutional database. But administrative data is a little more constrained in the sense that the reach of the administration is finely limited. It can't go all the way far. You take EPFO data for employment. It is as much as EPFO goes and not beyond that. You take any other place where you have administrative data, it is going to be limited to the reach of the administration. Whereas if you take data from institutions that touch all kinds of people, like Google mobility data, I think is extremely valuable. There is a lot of value in that data coming in from millions of users of Google systems. So I think there is a great movement towards institutional data coming in of new kinds. They are big data. I think there are big opportunities to use all of that data. Some of them are private, like credit card usage that used to be used in a big way in the past. Even now it is used, but they are kind of private. I think new avenues of data are coming in, which are, I think, very valuable, very potent. They can throw light, they can make household surveys redundant in many ways. As a business organization, I'm keeping a hawk's eye on that. But administrative data, I'm a little more less impressed with, because it depends upon the reach of the administration.
Yeah, I think there's a mix in terms of the quality of the administrative data. And as Sonal said, the NREGA portal we've looked at, and it's really pretty good. But some other schemes, it seems suspect in some way. The MORD data on SHG membership is also fairly decent. Although a simple thing, I was talking to Mr. Mohanan the other day. If you wanted to look at the proportion of households in a district where at least one woman is an SHG member, that's very hard to calculate, because the MORD gives you the number of women or number of households which have an SHG member, but there's no denominator. And I was using the PLFS to calculate, and Mr. Mohanan said that's not right to do that because the sample is not representative at the district level. Anyway, so these are all the challenges, I guess, that those of us who use data face. Are there any sort of wrapping up? Because, we've, obviously, as you see from this discussion, there are many points of agreement, but also there are many points of disagreement. And I think it's just the way it should be. As academics, we know that through discussion and debate and disagreement comes, come insights. And so I'm absolutely not troubled by the discussion. In fact, I welcome it. And Mahesh, because you have been in the line of the firing line recently, I also welcome your, attitude in terms of, okay, I'll respond to these criticisms. I think that's just the way it should be. And that just makes for a richer, more transparent data, availability data infrastructure, which is what we would like. Hopefully, I'm really hoping that NSS data will be available in real time. And, for example, through COVID, mortality data, for example, or disease incidents, how many people suffered because of COVID-related disease, not mortality or mortality. All of these estimates have been done by researchers by pulling together a variety of data sources. All of that could have been averted if, in fact, we had data coming out from the government in real time. For example, in the United States, we know that inequality from the US data, we know that regions where inequality is higher is also where COVID struck more deeply. But in India, to make that connection between inequality and COVID distress is harder because we don't have many of the pieces that we need of data that we need. So, if anybody official is watching this panel discussion, I wouldn't be wrong, I think, on behalf of all the panelists, if I could say that we would really benefit. And I think public policy instruments, public policy discourse would be that much richer if we got data in real time that we could analyze. I think all of us are engaged in the same pursuit. The end game for everybody is the same, which is to tailor policy, to understand society, to understand problems, and to suggest solutions in different ways that are informed, that are rigorous, that are empirically grounded. And the three individuals on my panel, the absolute stalwarts, are in their own way engaged in that exercise. And while there could be points of discussion and difference, but I think that's good. It's good that we are here, we are talking to each other, we are willing to respond to each other. And unless there are some closing remarks that anyone, one minute each of closing remarks, and then we will end this discussion. Sonal, you want to?
Thank you, Ashwini, for organizing this panel. It's been a great discussion and great honor to be on this panel with, Mahesh, Mr. Mohanan, and you. Thank you.
Mr. Mohanan?
Yeah, thank you for organizing this. It was a quite refreshing thing. My only appeal to researchers to use the data, pay a little more attention to the process of data collection, how it is collected, what is missing, who is missing in this data set, and things like that, which unfortunately, as technology improves for them to analyze the data, this aspect is not really sometimes thought of. So
absolutely,
pay a little more attention to the process of data generation. Thank you all.
No, this is such an important point, and we tell students this all the time, but they are so caught up with the beauties of Stata or R or Python or whatever. You don't really want to understand how the data was collected, and I couldn't stress this more. Thank you very much, Mahesh.
Well, I'll repeat what my co-panelists have said. Thank you very much indeed for organizing this excellent session. I am really honored to be in the presence of these stalwarts and having an opportunity to present my case or be my pugnacious self, and you people continuing to tolerate me. Thank you so much.
No, thank you to IISc for approaching us and allowing the SIDA IISc joint event, and happy birthday to SIDA. That's 1 year old. And look forward to many more interactions and conversations with you. Thank you very much. Thank you to the audience for the excellent questions and for engaging with the panelists in such a deep and insightful manner. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.